everyone for joining us, and good afternoon. My name is Alex Greco. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Association of Canada's Ontario chapter, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to a special COVID-19 polling presentation with Greg Lyle, with president of Innovative Research Group. Greg has always been very gracious with his time to join us for many presentations to unveil some of his latest polling on a wide variety of issues and where things are at in terms of our politics. But today we're especially pleased to have Greg join us, given the fact that we are in a unique time in the history of our country, given what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's no shortage of things that are going on in terms of overall politics, but also key issues, reopening of economies across the country, but also where public attitudes are at overall within Canada. So a couple housekeeping items before we start. If you do have a question or a comment for Greg, please submit your questions and comments in the Q&A chat box. And we'll be moderating the Q&A once Greg finishes his presentation. Additionally, we are on Twitter, so you could join the conversation by using the hashtag PAC84 to do any live tweeting of some of Greg's findings during his presentation. So with that in mind, Greg, I will turn it over to you to kick us off and begin your presentation.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining us at various times across the country. What I'm going to do is talk to you about what COVID has done to the GR environment. I'm going to start by talking about how it's making a difference in people's everyday lives, talk about the impact on corporate reputation, look at any potential changes to the policy playing field that the governments are operating within, and then dive into the government work. Everything I'm talking about is all available on our website. It's a lot of information, and it's actually not the simplest thing to navigate. So one of the things I'm working on in my spare time is a special landing page to sort all this stuff out, but it's all there to be found. And if you have any questions, if there's something that you were curious about and couldn't find, just send me a message by email or tweet or LinkedIn. So to start with, I want to talk about COVID-19 as a state of mind. And one of the things that's been interesting to me has been the lack of intensity in some of the attitudes we're seeing. So when we ask people, how concerned are you that you yourself will contact COVID-19, only 22% say that they're very concerned. And at the start, it was only a little bit higher, about 24% very concerned. People are more concerned about vulnerable friends or family, but even so, that's only at 33%. But there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that people feel positive about the changes that you're, so you can just jump straight to slide 4. Lois, just go to 4. Yeah, just keep going. That's 2. 2 more. Lois, can you advance? So just go to slide 4. All right, so there's an interesting box there on the bottom, but you can see there that when we ask people, agree, disagree, I'm worried that if we don't take special precautions, COVID-19 could come back and put more lives at risk. There's strong agreement with that. 47%, there's some formatting issues there, but we'll live with it. When we look at the question of, I'm confident that I'm taking all the steps I need to protect myself, we also see over 80% agreeing that I'm taking all the steps I need to protect myself. So it's not that COVID isn't scary, but that combination of people feeling they're doing what they need to do, plus their confidence in the programs that governments are implementing, which I'll show. You might want to mute yourself, Lois, just so that we don't all hear that. But when you put those two things together, what we see is that people are actually a lot less fearful than we thought they might have been. And we've also done questions on how much anxiety do you have, and how fearful, afraid, angry, all those sorts of emotions. And we just find that this is not as emotional an event as we thought, not because it couldn't be, but because people feel they're doing what they need to protect themselves, and that governments are generally doing a good job protecting themselves as well. Where we do see more of an impact is when we look at economic measures. So there's a great concern that Canada could be heading for a severe recession, in fact that we are in one. And there is some concern, not huge concern, but some growing concern that the company that you work for may not survive, or the organization you work for may not survive, and that if you do have to find another job, it could be harder than it's been for a while. So that's sort of where we are in terms of COVID as a state of mind. Something that could be scary, is scary in theory, but when people deal with it in everyday life, they feel pretty good about it. When we look at what they're doing, we also see it's a bit of there's some surprises in there as well. So the first thing is that people did a good job of minimizing their risks. We track behavior in terms of 4 categories of risk. Relatively low risk, making a trip to a grocery store or a drugstore. People continued to do that during the lockdown phase, but they were pretty good at trying to keep it to once or twice a week. Then there were sort of middle risk categories, going to a store other than a grocery store or drugstore, meeting up with a relative or a friend outdoors. A little over half of the people we were talking to were doing those sorts of activities at least once a week during the lockdown, but they weren't doing it a lot more than that. That's now gone up now that restrictions have eased, and we now have 3 out of 4 doing that sort of behavior. Then we have higher risk behaviors, things like visiting a relative or a friend in their home, hosting a relative or friend in your home, gathering with a small group inside a house, or meeting up with a small group outdoors. Those behaviors dropped down to 3 out of 10 in the lockdown. So most people were not doing those things, and those that were doing them were doing them very infrequently. That now, as we ease restrictions, has gone up to 55%. And then when we look at going to a large gathering of 50 people or more, 1 in 5, 1 in 10 have consistently been doing those things at the sort of once a week level all the way through this. That might have been, going to a large store, maybe could have been involved with travel. For instance, I live in BC and I take the ferry, and occasionally I'm in crowds, large crowds, not large crowds that don't keep their distance, they all keep their distance, but there's still a large crowd. So that's gone up a little bit, but not a lot with the easing of restrictions. What is more concerning, though, is the question of how you behave when you go out. And what we saw when people were fully engaged is 7 out of 10 saying that all the time they kept a distance of 2 meters. Now that we're easing restrictions, people are also easing their safe practices. And so the number that say that they always keep a distance of 2 meters from others when they're outside their home has dropped from 72% to 55%. The number that say that they're always washing their hands more frequently has dropped from 68% to 59%. That's offset to a degree because we've got more people saying they're wearing masks. That's gone from 36% saying all or most of the time to 45% all or most of the time. But the primary tools of keeping a safe distance and washing our hands, we are not as rigorous in pursuing. Should we really worry about that? Well, when we look at, I'm not sure if the slides are keeping up now, but if we do catch up with the slides, it'll be slide 12. When we look at people that say they were self-isolating, those people, even though they said they were self-isolating, were still going out. They were making trips to drugstores, 40 to 50%. They were hosting friends and relatives in their own homes when they said they were self-isolating, 15% in one way, 23% in another. So people's idea of self-isolation and quarantine was a lot softer than what was intended by our medical leaders. When we looked at the behavior of people that had traveled from outside of Canada, we saw some really alarming stuff. So in the midst of the pandemic, 50% of people that had come back into Canada within the last 2 weeks, 50% of them had made a trip to a grocery store or drugstore. That's actually against the medical orders in many places in Canada now, and clearly against the advice that people were given when they came to the airport. 48% were making a trip to a grocery store or a drugstore. 43% were meeting up with friends or relatives outdoors. 40% had visited a friend or a relative in their homes. And these are people coming back to Canada from other places. And so when you look at the studies that are being done that show that many of the infections came from not just from China, but from the United States and from Europe, you can see how it got out, because people who should have been staying home were not. And it's not that they were necessarily going out every day or all the time, but they were supposed to stay home all the time, and many of them didn't. And so that's something for us to bear in mind as we go forward. We did behave, many of us did our best to follow the direction of the medical officer, but there were still a large number of people that did not, and did not all the way through. It's not like they had a problem doing that in March, but then they got better as they went along. We sort of geared up in that second, third week of March, and wherever we were by the end of March, that's essentially where we stayed until just a week or so ago. When we look at the impact of COVID on industry rep, we find most industries have been seen as doing quite well on this. So we tested 26 different sectors a couple of weeks ago, and we tested 12 sectors in our first wave. 3 sectors really built reputation in this COVID response. Grocery stores, pharmacies, hospitals, all of those organizations had in the neighborhood of about 70% more people that said that they were doing a good job than a poor job in responding to the challenge of COVID. So hospitals, obviously the front line of the COVID-19 outbreak, but pharmacies and grocery stores forced to remain open to provide necessities, really were building reputation through their efforts. Another large group, most other sectors, were seen as in the range of 40 to as much as 50% more people saying they did a good job than a bad job. Restaurants were the highest of those, but commercial transport, electrical utilities, streaming services, independent retailers, internet service providers, big box stores, universities, gardening and nurseries, farms and ranches, banks, K-12 schools, colleges and CEGEPs, manufacturing, construction, public transit, and cell and mobile phone service providers, all of them were seen as being net positive in terms of did they leave a better impression from the way they managed this. There were 3 sectors that had more positive than negative, but a significant amount of negative. And that's the airlines, residential landlords, and insurance companies. And we've all heard controversies associated with each of them. And then 3 groups that actually lost ground in the way they responded to COVID. They won't be a big surprise to people. Meat packing plants, retirement homes, and nursing or long-term care homes. They actually hurt their reputations as they went through this. When we go, so that's, for most industries, this pandemic has actually been an opportunity to raise their reputation, raise their standings with people. Companies that got into difficulty because of the way they managed their customer relationships didn't actually lose ground, but were in a vulnerable position. And the companies that are associated with actual health risk, where people were seen as being part of people getting sick. Those companies lost ground, and that's not a big surprise, I don't think, to anyone. But as you think about your individual organizations going forward, nothing is more important than safety. That's an obvious thing to say, but it's absolutely clear. How you deal with refunds, issues like that, have their own issues. But if you are seen to be taking risks with your customers or your workforce, you are going to suffer for that. Looking at the policy playing field, there's been a lot of talk about, is this the time to pivot for transformation? We asked the question, one of the priorities for government has been dealing with the economic impacts of COVID-19. Which of the following comes closest to your point of view? The COVID-19 pandemic shows that we need to radically transform our economy to work differently in the future, versus there's always room for improvement, but the economy was working pretty well before COVID-19. We find 50% are looking for us to radically transform our economy. But it gets challenging once you look at underlying numbers. So what does transformation look like? Well, one thing it might have looked like is maybe we're making a shift to the left. Maybe this is a Bernie moment where we see more socio-democratic values come into the fray. As it happened, just from the luck of the draw, we had done a big study on economic values in February, just before the pandemic hit. And so we have a perfect chance to see whether or not those sort of values are changing. So one thing, for instance, that we asked is the profits a company or business can earn should be either strictly limited by law to a certain level or as large as they can fairly earn. The majority of Canadians in February, 57%, said as large as they can fairly earn. It's actually even a little bit higher in May, 62%. And we see a number of issues like that, but another one that's of that ilk, when it comes to economic growth, should we let government take the lead and let business support government initiatives, or should we let business take the lead and government support business initiatives? 51% said let the business take the lead, only 27% said let government take the lead in February. With the pandemic, there's been an increase in deference. Government's played a big role. Has the public shifted? Do they now think government should play the lead role? And the answer is no. Again, we see an increase in the sort of pro-business perspective. It's gone from 51% to 56%. So we don't see this as a sort of socio-democratic, Bernie sort of moment. But by the same token, there's still a clear view of the role of government. So if government isn't the lead in this stance, there's still a role for them. So one question we ask is, which of these comes closest to your point of view? Government needs to be an active partner to help businesses compete in the world with incentives and training programs, or government helps business the best by reducing taxes and red tape and staying out of the way. Before the pandemic, it was 51% say government should be an active partner. After the pandemic is 54. So clearly government has a role. They also have a role as being the cop on the block. So when we ask people about government regulation of business, 50% say it's necessary to keep industry from being too powerful. 30% say it usually does more harm than good. And again, those numbers are pretty much the same before and after the pandemic. But there are some things that are changing. So one thing that has changed has been the trade-off between environment and economy. So this isn't to say that the environment isn't important, and it isn't to say that the economy wasn't important before. But when people had to choose, prior to the pandemic, we'd have roughly high 40s or 50% saying the environment comes first, and somewhere in around 40% or high 30s saying the economy should come first, with the extra 10% being uncertain. Now that the pandemic's hit, we saw the gap narrow, and ever since the beginning of April, we've seen it essentially a tie. We've measured it 3 times, 44% for the environment every time. The economy is 42, 43, 43. So a statistical tie, closing that 10-point gap between environment and the economy. We've also done some work on energy transition. We had done that in November, so we went back again to see where people were on that. And we saw a little bit more of what we were seeing in November, which is people are more likely to agree with statements that support the oil and gas position on energy transition than support the people that would move away. So for instance, 57% agree it's critical to Canada's ongoing prosperity that we responsibly develop and export our oil and gas resources, versus 42% agreeing the world is facing a climate emergency and it's irresponsible for Canada to add to the problem by developing new oil and gas projects. And those weren't a paired choice. That was agree, disagree with each of those statements individually. So the sort of pro-energy transition statements were in around the 40%, whereas most of the oil statements were 50% or more. One thing to bear in mind in all this is that people didn't know very much about energy transition when we first asked in November. They know a little bit more now, but it's still about half the public that are at least generally familiar with the word. The other half don't really know what you're talking about. So this is something that we fully expect to evolve. That said, though, as most of you probably know, the large employer financial support program, LEAF, that program includes requiring these major employers to submit climate change reporting. And so we asked about that specific thing. We said, and again, this is a choice, pick one of these two points of view. It's a good idea to add new requirements on climate-related reporting to leverage the funding governments provide to business to achieve long-term climate goals. Or do you say it's a bad idea to add new requirements on climate-related reporting when companies should be focused on survival and protecting jobs? Well, 46% say it's a good idea. Only 32% say it's a bad idea. But when we introduced the idea, we asked how familiar people were with it. And when we look at support by familiarity, we find the people that say they're very familiar actually are more likely to say it's a bad idea. 49% of the people that know the most about this program say it's a bad idea to require the climate-related reporting. 44% say it's a good idea. And it's not that 49% are against taking action on climate change. They just think it's more important to focus on the survival of those businesses and their jobs than it is to make progress right this very moment on a long-term goal. So that's a little bit of a bird in the canary as this issue rolls out and people become more familiar with it. The government may not see as much support as it initially saw. So it's complicated on the environment. It's not a straightforward decision. We're likely to see support for these initiatives in the short run, in part cushioned by the rally effect. But there is some indication that if the downturn becomes more serious or the debate becomes more heated, the government may not see the initial support hold. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of the playing field that has fundamentally changed is the question of populism. So again, with populism, there's a lot of measures that we use in this, but we have an indicator that we use more frequently, which again is one of these priority questions, where we ask people to pick one of the following two positions. Too often government listens to experts instead of common sense, or provincial issues are complicated, so government should listen to experts when it comes to policy. And we don't have that perfectly on the screen for some reason. But anyhow, you can see the initial point of view on the left-hand side of the screen. Listen to experts was only 38%, use common sense was 47%. That's flipped. So today, we have 40% saying use common sense and 48% saying listen to experts. This is a really big change. That, what we call decline of deference, that took place back in the late 80s, early 90s. That's associated with the rise of the Reform Party, Meech Lake Accord, all that sort of stuff, the Charlottetown Accord. All of those occurred at a moment in which Canada shifted from being our sort of traditional peace and good order sort of place to being more populist, more grassroots driven. And we're moving away from that, at least for the short run. And no doubt in part due to the fact that Canadians are impressed with the way that experts like Bonnie Henry here in BC have been leading Canada's response to the COVID-19 epidemic. So whether that lasts is a whole other question. But in the short run, it contributes to this rally effect that we've been seeing. So let's just talk a little bit about that. If you take a look at slide 31, if that shows up, what we're seeing is whether we ask about provincial governments, federal governments, or municipal governments, a majority of Canadians approve of the job they're doing in handling the outbreak of COVID-19. For the provincial governments, it's 69% on average. Federal government is 63%, so a little bit behind, and municipalities at 56% approval. If we look at the tracking, I hope that works out. If we look at this over time, what you see in the tracking is that the federal government started out a little bit low when we first started tracking, but it got better as we went along, and the other provinces, the provincial government started strong and moved on from there. On slide 32, what we see is overall satisfaction with the provincial government and also with the federal government. And what you see there is that overall satisfaction has been lifted by the response to COVID-19. So in Quebec, it's been a little bit up and down. They had sky-high approval at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, in part because of the way that Legault took on the federal government on the issue of travelers coming back to Canada. And they got a big lift. We're one too far if you're looking at the Alberta Party leader. Just go back. So the, one more, should be 32. Doesn't want to go. Anyhow, the bottom line is that Quebec had a big spike at the start because of the way it was dealing with the federal government. The federal government had a bit of a drop in Quebec itself. But once the federal government started to move more aggressively in terms of dealing with international travelers, their numbers moved up in Quebec to catch up with the rest of the country. And Quebec has come down a bit as a result of the issues they've had there with long-term care homes, etc. But the bottom line is that all the governments right now are looking at approval numbers well into the 50% level. And it's lifted a whole bunch of things. Issues like confidence in the way that the electricity systems run. All sorts of things like that that are associated with government leadership have all improved as a result of the management of the pandemic, and they continue to remain strong. There's no sign in the short run of this rally fading. And there's been partisan impacts that are important. So, you know, I don't dwell on the horse race numbers. All the incumbent governments are seeing their vote numbers improve, some of them quite dramatically. But I buy into the point of view that says that this rally effect, when it fades, vote numbers will likely drop as well. What I was more interested in our work is looking at leader brands. And so one of the questions that we ask on a regular basis is, do you have a favorable or unfavorable impression of various party leaders? And for Justin Trudeau on slide 33, when he of course went sky high after his first election in 2015, he got pulled back closer to ground on the India trip, and then he went into negative territory as a result of SNC-Lavalin. And he stayed in negative territory even through the last election campaign. There were more people that disliked Justin Trudeau than liked him. Well, he's now positive again. He's at a plus 13, makes it competitive with Blanchette, makes it competitive with Singh, and way ahead of Andrew Scheer, and also significantly ahead of the two main contenders, McKay and O'Toole, who are looking at -10, -12 sort of numbers in terms of favorables minus unfavorables. So more negative impressions than positive impressions. So whoever the Tory leader is, they're going to be behind all the other party leaders in terms of their net favorables, at least to start. When we look at Alberta, the story in Alberta is a little bit similar to the Trudeau thing, just not as dramatic an impact. What we were seeing with Kenny is that Kenny had a net negative impact, or net negative reputation. His reputation is now net positive, not particularly strongly, but still well, now over the balance mark. So he has more people favorable than unfavorable, a little bit of a lift there. When we look at Doug Ford, we see a really remarkable turnaround. So Doug Ford at one point had 40% more people that had a negative view of him, an unfavorable view, than had a positive view. He's now at a +18. That's double Andrew Horvath, who's down at 9%, and Del Duca is in actually slightly negative territory. And then if we take a look at BC, we see something really quite remarkable. We've got Horgan moving up from being slightly positive to being strongly positive with a +39 score. And it's really interesting because, if you think about the difference between Ford, who we just saw, and Horgan, Ford has been front and center every day. He leads the government response, much as Trudeau has done nationally. Horgan has been taking a backseat. The daily briefing is run by the chief medical officer and the minister of health. He only gets into the spotlight once a week or so, dealing with broader public issues, not the specific issues around what businesses have to close and those sort of measures. So very different style, but just as dramatic an improvement as we've seen with Ford, although for Horgan, because he started in a positive place, he's even in a stronger position. So when the rally fades, the question is, will these positives fade? And they'll probably fade a bit, but it's likely to be a lasting benefit to these leaders when we see these types of brand improvements. And if we were looking at leadership attributes, things, questions like strength and confidence, as it stands right now, if we were testing it, I think it's pretty clear that we would see all of these incumbent leaders seeing major gains on all those attributes, which is of great benefit because it's a key driver of vote as we go forward. So we'll see as people reflect back and they look at the decisions with the benefit of a rearview mirror, whether or not they continue to feel that these were strong, decisive, competent moves. But remember that we have this thing called confirmatory bias. So if we feel a certain way and we look at new information, we try and interpret that information in a way to confirm our initial point of view. So that means all these leaders have now got the high ground and they can manage from the high ground. The last leader who's seen a really dramatic improvement is Francois Legault. And you can see here he's a +40, so he's right in the same range as Horgan. The government numbers have been going up and down a bit, but his approval numbers steadily improved and then held. And so that's very important because, as people that watch Quebec closely know, the CAQ is a new party, does not have a strong partisan base. Many of the people that say they're voting for the CAQ right now are people that feel loyal to Quebec Liberals or the Parti Québécois. They don't feel like techies at this point. And the question will be, will we get a partisan realignment in Quebec sometime soon? Without that partisan realignment, then these favorables are really important to sustaining a CAQ majority. So it has very important implications for where we go in politics in Quebec. So in terms of what's next, we asked Canadians whether they think that governments are going to ease restrictions in the coming months. When that happens, that we'll be able to return to a more regular way of life, whether we're going to have a second wave and then we'll be back to normal, or whether there'll be continuing outbreaks for the foreseeable future. Most people think that we're in this for the long run, and very few people think that this is it. There's a quarter of the public that say that we've got a second wave coming and then we'll be okay. But clearly people see that there's more to come. One of the things that's interesting as part of that is that there is some nervousness about the pace of reopening. So federally, not as high. 27% say that the federal government may be going too fast. Only 16% say too slow. Provincially, though, we've got 33% saying provincial governments are going too fast. Only 13% say too slow. In both cases, roughly 50% say they've got the right pace right now. But you can see a little bit of nerves in terms of the speed in which we're proceeding. And when we look across the country, the most nervous places are Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta. So we also went on to ask people just last week about a series of priorities that government should consider and how important each of those priorities were. We did about 14 of them. 7 of them were, or 12 of them, 6 of them were healthcare related. Changes to the long-term care system, managing transmission from international travelers, being able to manufacture more of our own critical health supplies, preparing hospitals in case of a future spike, increasing public health agencies' capacity to conduct testing and contact tracing, and catching up on scheduled surgeries. And then we also asked a bunch of economic ones. Every single health priority beat any of the economic ones, and it also beat education and fiscal concerns. So it's really, really clear that when you ask the public what government should be focusing on, they want governments to focus on the next wave. That is their number one priority. Use this time now to make sure when the next wave hits, that we are well prepared, that we get long-term care under control, that we give hospitals the resources that we need, that we get PPE to all the providers that might need PPE. And one thing that we did in looking at this is that we asked people to approve or disapprove of the job the federal and provincial governments have done, and we developed a grid to look at where are their strengths and weaknesses for governments, because this is essentially where the politics lies. The vulnerabilities for governments are the things that are relatively low in satisfaction and high in terms of importance. And the big vulnerability is making changes to the long-term care system. That's true federally. It's also true provincially. For the feds, they're actually getting a surprisingly large net satisfaction score on managing transmission from travelers. But it's a significant issue, and it's lower than some of the other issues that are out there. And then the other vulnerability, potential vulnerability, is catching up on scheduled surgeries. The reducing extra government spending is what we would call a latent strength, but it's relatively weak among the strengths, which means it's not a big priority yet, but it's something that's inching over into the negative satisfaction category. When we look at provinces, we see the same basic story that we see federally. The one thing I would just flag, though, is when you look at our provincial reports, you'll see that in Ontario, making changes to the long-term care system isn't a slightly satisfied score, it's a slightly dissatisfied score. So in Ontario in particular, making changes to long-term care is already showing up in the critical weakness spots. It's not threatening to go there, it is there right now. And just to wrap this up before we go to any questions, the last slide I've got, slide 46, is tracking on a question that we started asking in 2004, which is below is a list of possible threats to the vital interests of Canada in the next 10 years. Please tell me whether you think it's a critical threat, important but not critical, not an important threat at all. And we asked about pandemics, so we've added COVID-19 now, but earlier we talked about AIDS and the flu and other potential pandemics. And so in 2004, it was right after SARS. And concern about pandemics was the number one concern ahead of climate change, ahead of terrorism, ahead of immigrants, ahead of globalization. Then it just went to being the last of those priorities when we went back in 2010. Only 16% said it was critical. Now it's right back up at 56%. And so the reason I'm showing this is that we're in the midst of the pandemic moment. But I mean, let's just think about this year alone, right? In January, we were in the midst of the forest fires in Australia. The world was on fire. That was going to be the issue of the year. That was going to be the thing that we all talked about. Then in February and early March, blockade shut down the railways and a bunch of other institutions, and it was now Indigenous issues was crowding out everything else. So now we're in the middle of a pandemic that has much more widespread impacts than the SARS pandemic did. And so we're all about that as the big threat that we're going to be focused on. But I think the message that I have for you is that we are fickle. We're also smart and adaptive. And so I don't know where the solution to COVID-19 will come from. Maybe it will come from treatments that we will do as we did with AIDS and find a way not to cure it, but to live with it. Maybe we'll find the vaccine. Maybe it will just die out. But whatever, at some point in time, COVID will get back into a box. And then the question is, what will we move on to? And that question remains to be determined. So that's it from me. Alex, do you want to move on to questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Greg. And first off, I want to acknowledge for you to stick handling our technical difficulties with the slides, and everyone, I want to apologize for those technical difficulties. We will be circulating the slides following the presentation, so we really appreciate your patience. We have time for a couple questions. So I'll start with this question. It was an anonymous attendee, but Greg, this attendee asked, does this survey assume government guidelines around quarantine are clear to travelers? I would argue it has not been clear in my own experience and the experiences of my close family and friends. Example, going for walks, using delivery services for food. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. We asked people. So I think so we've done 8 waves now. In the third wave, there was already some concern coming up. This was sort of early April over whether or not the direction was clear. And we asked people, is it clear to you what you're supposed to do? 80% said yes, I'm certain I know what to do. And some of them were don't know. So less than 20% said no, I'm not getting clear direction. So most people felt, now that doesn't mean that they understood it correctly, but they didn't feel confused.
Right on. And then David in Toronto asks, has the public's patience for the lockdown been reached? And if there is a second wave of COVID this fall, are we tapped out in terms of more stay-at-home medicine? Thanks.
Yeah, the answer to that is, the simple answer to that is no, we are not tapped out. So we actually had a measure of fatigue, and we did find, roughly 25% or so of the public that agreed with the statement, I don't know how long I can keep doing this. And we've probed some specific issues. So for instance, child care is clearly an issue, trying to resolve that. The parents were more fatigued than others. But most people said, no, I can keep doing this. And we also are seeing more people concerned about the pace of reopening than concerned it's going too fast than too slow. And then when we look at and people clearly believe that we're going to have another, maybe not as firm a lockdown. I mean, what we just asked in our last survey is that we put 2 approaches to restrictions. So one approach, we didn't label it the BC approach, but it was the BC approach. So what BC did is that they said, you can stay open so long as you can meet our guidelines of making sure that there's 6 meters distance and all that sort of physical distancing stuff, unless we specifically order you closed. And so they ordered restaurants closed except for takeout. They ordered hair salons closed, personal services closed. Everything else they left open. In Ontario, for instance, they did a different approach. They said, you have to close unless we say you can open. And so they put together a list of essential services. The public prefers the BC approach over Ontario, by almost a 2-to-1 measure. So they would rather the government say, that you can stay open so long as you take steps to ensure physical distancing and other types of safety. But if if we don't think it's safe, then we're going to order you closed, as opposed to saying everyone's closed unless we can say you're open. So there is that sort of sense of being having a light but firm hand.
Right, right. Very interesting. And then to build on that, Cheryl Muir asks, are you able to speak to regional differences as it relates to the anxiety/fear of the virus? Wondering if results vary depending on the severity of the outbreak, as well as regional differences on the environment versus economy trade-off question, particularly BC, please, if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, so two different questions. On the issue of fear, there aren't strong differences. I'm sure that if I took a magnifying glass out and I looked carefully at the crosstabs, I could find some differences. But basically, in terms of fear, we're basically all experiencing the same thing through the media, the social media, and the mass media that we get, right? So it's just like with Black Lives Matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't live in Buffalo, but I saw that old gentleman pushed down by the police, and I was outraged. And and so we're all experiencing those moments together, almost as North Americans, certainly as Canadians. And so, in terms of the level of fear, it's pretty consistent. And it's also worth noting that generally, in most places, people feel confident in most of the measures that their governments are putting forward, long-term care aside.
Mm-hmm.
On the issue of environment, though, it is different, right? So Quebec is clearly the most green of all the provinces in Canada, and most likely to support those sort of energy transition type measures. BC overall is not more green, but it has more passionate Greens. And so the people that really care about this stuff, there's more intensity on the issue in BC than there is anywhere other than Quebec. But for instance, BC on Trans Mountain, the pipeline, a majority of people in BC give permission to that pipeline to go ahead. So it's just that there's that passionate group, and that passionate group is also geographically focused on Vancouver Island, right? So there's more passionate Greens on Vancouver Island than anywhere else in BC. Right. And then that has political repercussions. That's where the Greens are electing their members.
Well put there. We're almost at time, so we'll either have time for one, maybe two questions, but most likely only one question. Scott Anderson asked, does any of your current research measure the confidence by the electorate in government's ability to dig themselves out of the massive budget deficit that COVID-19 has created? Is there any distinction between the federal and Ontario government leaders?
I think there's a lot of distinction between different provincial leaders and the federal government. Because again, confirmatory bias, right? Even though the aggregate numbers look pretty similar, the people that like Doug Ford are more likely to be conservative voters, and the people that like Justin Trudeau are more likely to be liberal voters. And so they don't have the same supporters and they don't have the same opponents, even though they're at roughly similar levels of support. What was the other part of that?
The other problem was, is there any distinction between the federal and Ontario government leaders?
But it's on fiscal though. So yeah. On fiscal. So, if we ask people, are you concerned about the deficit? The answer is yes, and there's a growing number of people who are concerned about the deficit. But when we say, what's the most important issue for governments to face, and we give them a list of 12, the deficit is 12, right? And so we actually dug a little bit deeper in our last poll, and we said, do you think we should keep spending what it takes to deal with everyone's needs? Do you think we should start targeting money on the people most in need for COVID, even if that means taking money away from others, words to that effect? Or do you think we should just focus on balancing the budget? And most people ended up in that middle category of, we need to be more focused on this. We can't just keep throwing it around. But that being said, if we then went further and said, should we, should we take these people off this program? Should we take these people off this program? I think you would start running into resistance pretty quickly. So it's out there, it's growing. In the complicated world of politics, If you were running, say, for leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, you'd run into a lot more people concerned about those issues than if you were just stopping people on the street. So, you know, there's a group of people, it might be in the 20-25% category, that are becoming increasingly concerned about this, but the vast majority of people, a million, a billion, a trillion, it doesn't make any difference to them. There are needs, and they want to see those needs addressed.
Right, right. I know we're a little over time, so everyone, I know there's a few more questions that have still been submitted through the chat function. So we are going to make sure we get answers back to you for those remaining questions. But at this time, I'm going to turn over to our president of the Alberta chapter, Talisha Thorgood, to thank Greg and to make some final comments. Talisha.
Thanks, Alex. First of all, thanks, Greg, for your time today. I know I found it extremely insightful and helpful as we go through this time, and I know the same is true for our attendees as well. So thanks for taking the time to be with us and participate. Next, thank you to all of you for joining us. I know it's a busy and hectic time for everyone, and so we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to be here. If you have further questions regarding today's events or PAC in general, the email that you can reach out to is at the top of the chat function. We'd be happy to get back to you about PAC or about today's event, or if you have any feedback as well. In addition to that, if you have any suggestions for future webinar topics, we'd be more than happy to take those and see what we might be able to put together for future events. And that can also be sent to the email at the top. Lastly, our Ontario chapter has also released a document yesterday with communication to members, basically outlining work they're doing in the advocacy space. And so if you have any comments on that, we really want to help out public professionals in whatever way we can. And so we're doing work to advocate for you as members. If you're not already a member, please feel free to reach out if you have questions, but also you can join at the link at the top of the chat function as well on our website at publicaffairs.ca. Thanks to Alex for his help in coordinating and organizing today's event. And yeah, I really appreciate you all being here, and thanks for taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.